This is Pastor Matt Smith, Senior Pastor of Barabbas Road Church. For the past 16 years, it has been my joy to equip the saints for the work of the ministry by preaching the Bible verse by verse, line by line, the whole counsel of God. Our audio and video messages have reached over 158 countries and are listened to by over 5,000 people each week. Many of you who listen weekly have been through our doors, and I'm thankful that you continue to use us as a resource for your enrichment and edification. We consider you all a part of our extended church family. As you know, San Diego is a spiritually dark and financially difficult place to exist as a local church, and yet, by God's plan and purpose, He's placed us here to boldly challenge the false faith by teaching that Jesus is the only way, truth, and life. My desire is that we would continue to be a bastion of light in this dark area, that we would keep bringing you consistent biblical teaching on a weekly basis. To that end, I'm asking that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us in your missions giving. To do so, go to Barabbas.com/give. I'm thankful for this task and look forward to our partnership for years to come.
Things they're saying, for example, I mentioned Tim Walz, the VP candidate for president on the Democrats, is openly socialist. He's mentioned, socialism is just good old-fashioned neighborliness. I'm like, well, tell that to the 250 million people that have died from that good old-fashioned neighborliness. But it's a big deal. Here's the challenge. Charles Spurgeon understood at the same time period that he was preaching, Karl Marx was sort of becoming popular and the Communist Manifesto was doing its thing. And they were aware of each other, certainly, and he spoke against it in the church because what Marx was presenting was an alternative spirituality meant to literally destroy everything God made. And the ultimate hatred was against God. Spurgeon recognized it, he preached against it, and now we live in a moment where we just sort of don't know what it means. You'll hear someone call someone, I think in the debate, Trump called Kamala Harris a Marxist, and everyone's like, no one even knows what that means. And so we might have heard it's bad, hey, Marxism's bad, communism's bad, socialism's bad, but it's all mushed up. What's really wrong with it? So the book we're going through right now is called The Devil and Karl Marx, and it's a very well-researched book, but it's dealing less about all the details of Marxism and focusing on the man himself that started it. And so tonight we're going to go and just deal with sort of his life in brief, and we'll go from there. But let me say a quick prayer. And so God, I pray that as we go through this book, you'd help us to understand. It's not always fun to read about these things, but truly you want us to know our enemy, understand that the philosophies, and take down in our spiritual warfare is standing against the doctrines of demons. And I can think of no more demonic doctrine than this. And so I just ask that we would be bold as we hear these things. Give me wisdom to go forward and just help us to understand that you've called us for this time to know these things, to be watchmen on the wall, to understand what they mean and to spot them as they come into our own thinking and understand how your gospel is the answer to these things. Help us to know how to be a true light in this darkness and have compassion. Father, but for your grace, would we be tied up in just a miserable philosophy like this? And so I pray that you'd give us a great appreciation for your grace in our own lives. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so again, Marx was essentially a freeloading sort of hippie mooch. And that's the best way to describe it. So when you think about sort of and this chapter is a little bit humorous, but the reason this chapter is so relevant, okay, so if I said to you, I got this big philosophy, you need to hear about it. If you're raising your kids are upstairs doing adventure club, you've got the thing, you've got all this stuff happening, you're like, what in the world am I doing on Tuesday night learning about Karl Marx? And I'm going to reiterate, it's helpful for us as Christians to know this is the philosophical stuff that has invaded all of our school systems from the cradle to the grave. This is all of our entitlement systems. This is what's come into a lot of the way we view, even when we talk about things like abuse and things, we talk about the system and we talk about the oppressed, where if someone has power, it's more dangerous. All the frameworks that we're using, they're just coming in from this Marxism. And so it all has been coming in. So I want you to understand the man himself. So let's just get into it a little bit. It says, and since that heart is obviously animated and governed by a demon, not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian? This is a quote here that we're going to see from Marx's father. And he says, so pondered a pensive and perturbed Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, in a letter to his son written March 2nd, 1837. So again, quite a bit of time ago, but not that long ago. America was founded in 1776. And so if you understand, America is a system that is not, so the American experiment is not overtly Christian, let me just say that, but it is based unapologetically on Christian presuppositions, from the value of human beings, made in the image of God, to the value of merit and work and equality that leads to the opportunities to have different things. So Marxism fights not for equality, but every time you hear someone use the word equity, so you guys have heard the word equity before, right? So let me see, equity. Every time you hear equity, that's Marxism. All right, so equality is the idea that everyone has an equal opportunity to excel, but equity means no matter what you do, you end up with the same outcome. And you say to yourself, well, what's so big about that? So Marx himself, you're going to find out, wanted everyone to end up with the same outcome because he's the guy that when you did your school project, didn't want to do the work with everybody, and so he just wanted to reap the rewards. And so here's his father. I want you to understand where he comes from. It says, this was the heart, Heinrich was concerned about what was animating and governing his son's heart. I'm going to read you a portion of his dad's letter to him and ask yourself if this is a guy we think should be giving us philosophy advice. His dad says this, at times my heart delights in thinking of you and your future, and yet at times I cannot rid myself of ideas, which arouse in me sad forebodings and fear when I'm struck as if by lightning by the thought, is your heart in accord with your head, your talents? Has it room for the earthly but gentler sentiments, which in this veil of sorrow are so essentially consoling for a man of feeling? I wish we wrote things like this to one another. And since that heart is obviously animated and governed by a demon, not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian? Will you ever, and that is not the least painful doubt in my heart, will you ever be capable of truly human domestic happiness? Imagine a father writing this to his son. His will, and this doubt has no less tortured me recently since I've come to love a certain person like my own child. Will you ever be capable of imparting happiness to those immediately around you? This is for a father to say this about his son. Like, it's one thing to meet your friend that's kind of moochy, but then to hear the father be like, what's up, man? Like, you're like, oh man, this is a character flaw. And Marxism adopts it. It's at the same time a prophetically sad question, a concession as well as a premonition by the father. Could Karl ever be happy? What was possessing his heart? So it's a good question. It's one that today we're going to talk about briefly in this chapter, all right? So this is chapter 3 of this book. So Karl Marx was born on May 5th, 1818 in the city of Trier, one of the loveliest, oldest, most tranquil, most peaceful, most religious, and most deeply Catholic cities in Germany. And one of the things that you're going to notice is I'm not Catholic, and I actually think Catholicism is very troubling. And I think that Catholicism is one of the things that really made Marx who he is. And so I don't want to be unfair. The author of this book is Catholic, so he likes Catholicism. I'm going to take issue with him. But in any case, the population of the place he was born was 90% Roman Catholic. And so the argument I would argue is, when you think of Catholicism, I want you to think of Catholicism like Islam, like Judaism, as a geopolitical entity. So when you say that 90% of the people are Roman Catholic, that means that the city itself that he grew up in, operated from the idea that the sort of the governments and the rules and the regulations, they were all sort of incestuously intertwined with the church. Does that make sense in such a way? So like the laws that were passed, so to him, he's living in a very Catholic place and in society. So reforming society is reforming and resisting this, we'll see. It's hard to find a more Catholic place. The roots of this place are remarkable. I mean, St. Ambrose, the future bishop of Milan, who brought Augustine to faith, was born in this city of Trier or whatever, in the year 340. It boasts the oldest church in Germany. There's a bunch of stuff about it, okay? And, Constantine, let's see here. Constantine was born there, I believe, or something like this. So it's just a very, very, very Catholic city. Not surprisingly, Karl Marx's literary idol, I looked up how to say this. It's Goethe. Goethe. It says it's spelled Goeth or whatever, go at the end, but it's Goethe. So his literary idol Goethe disapproved of he says, this place is burdened. So you think about like a Catholic country in this case, you say, well, at least it'd be moral. It should be people going to school, husbands should be loving their wives, kids should be like, there should be a moral place. Just think of when you think of a Catholic country, I want you to think of right now like the moral majority in politics. Like if we could just make our country more conservative, it'd be right. That's the place ostensibly that Marx grows up in. And to him, he says this place is burdened and oppressed with churches and chapels and cloisters and colleges and buildings dedicated to chivalrous and religious orders. I'm like, that sounds great. All right. And this is what Goethe said when he visited in 1793. And that same year, the Jacobin guillotine was dropping incessantly upon the necks of the Catholic people in France. So this guy's not very, he doesn't like Catholics, okay? And basically, Marx is the same way. Marx's family was actually Jewish, of all things, and so both his father and mother's sides, he was actually very Jewish, but he hated Jews. They weren't not only ethnically Jewish, but had a healthy family history of devout Judaism. And there had been several rabbis in the recent family history from the 19th century back to at least 17th century. And it'd be difficult to find anyone who had a more Jewish ancestry than Karl Marx, writes biographer David McClellan. So it was very Jewish ancestry, okay? But under social pressures of the day, and he's in Germany at this time, and under the social pressures of the day, Marx's father left Judaism and converted to Protestantism at some point in the late 1810s or 1820s. Now, look, I don't want to go astray on this. I just want you to focus on, there's something really interesting about this, okay? So right around 1820, his father went and became Protestant. Now, ask yourself, this is a kind of interesting development. Protestantism, I mean, if it's 90% Catholic, becoming Protestant doesn't make you more in the norm than being Jewish in a lot of ways. I mean, Protestants and Catholics weren't like, hey, we're all the same. I mean, you had the Counter-Reformation, you had all this stuff happening. So he chose Protestantism, and it's an interesting choice. Now, you have to remember, when we think today, and this is really, I want to not go astray, but I don't want to make you think this is like a weird egghead class where you have to know all this stuff, but just let me explain. When you think of like liberalism, kind of cultural liberalism, like humanism, right? You think of that all came around in, say, like the end of the 1800s, going into the 1900s, and it all came from the German critic, like higher scholastics, which was really what we're talking about, which developed into the thing that became what we now know of as sort of that liberalism that came into all the seminaries. So back when we said the seminaries, you mean cemeteries where you go to not learn, where higher criticism was like, was there really a Jesus? Was there this? That's the German higher criticism that really started here, and it came from this sort of weird Protestant view, which adopted sort of the liberalism of sort of humanism. And so when you think Protestant, you think of Reformation. I want you to think of like Lutheran, like liberal Lutheran, like not PCA Presbyterian, but PCUSA Presbyterians, the rainbow flag churches. Like when you think Protestant, I want you to think of like mainline Protestant sort of liberalism, okay? You're thinking of like, what are we thinking of? The Episcopal sort of like, female pastorix church that has like the plant ceremony for like, we're going to mourn the plants that died yesterday. That type of liberalism, okay? That's really kind of what was going on. And so Marx biographer Jonathan Sperber explains that Heinrich was much more liberal and is a product of Enlightenment who tellingly, if not fatefully, had read Voltaire aloud to young Karl. He knew Voltaire and Rousseau by heart. And with the sort of candor and disdainful language his son would use, Heinrich denounced what he called the Gospels polluted by ignorant priests in favor of what Sperber described as a liberal and enlightened Protestantism. Not entirely separate from deism, that would be Heinrich Marx's Christianity of choice. So here's I guess, what I'm getting at. The relevancy of what I'm saying right now is really important. It'd be like, okay, right now, if you watch a TV show or one of those, like, you follow people. Now, my wife always tells me, like, Matt, I don't follow all these people. My wife's not following people on Facebook all the time. But let's just say you meet a couple on Facebook, not Facebook, YouTube. You're on the YouTube and you see this couple and they have kids and you're like watching, oh, look, it's the something family. And they're a nice family. I'm like, it feels like every time I look them up, they're Mormon, right? You're like, oh gosh, they're Mormon, right? And then what do you say? Well, they got good values. I guess that's okay. Like Mormonism is an aberration, okay? Mormonism is pagan. It's a terrible view. But for the voting bloc, I mean, it's conservative. And then you got the Catholics, Catholicism, like, will lead you to hell if you don't understand the gospel. Like, it's bad, but they're conservative. And so the answer to, like, when you look at the sort of the liberalism and the abortion and stuff, people are like, well, we got Mormons, we got the Catholics. You kind of lump that together. None of those things give you the gospel, right? The conservatism doesn't bring you to the gospel. What Marx had as an alternative to the Catholicism was liberalism. Like, there was no like Bible reformation issue in his life. He was not, and this is true for a lot of people. A lot of people leave churches, and what they're rebelling against is not the God of the scripture. They're rebelling against the sentimental God of evangelicalism. They're rebelling against the weird God who doesn't believe in sin all of a sudden, telling you that's unfair, they didn't help it. They're not rebelling against the God of this book, and Marx is going to be in the same scenario right now. He's rebelling against the priests they're right, these priests that were ignorant and had polluted the gospels, but the answer wasn't like German liberalism. And so these were Marx's sort of choices here. Heinrich ended up becoming Lutheran, which doesn't mean Lutherans are all bad, but like this is an ironic thing if you know history. But I just want to put that to the side. If you're interested in it, there's a lot to think about here. But Heinrich saw some value in believing in God, and he advised Karl that a good support for morality is simple faith in God. So he had some faith. And he goes, I'm the last person to be a fanatic, but sooner or later a man has a real need of this faith, and there are moments in life, even when the man who denies God's compelled against his will to pray to the Almighty. So his dad was at best nominal in his faith, if at all. All right? I'm not saying his dad was an actual bona fide Christian, but he spoke about faith in God nonetheless, and that was basically what he gets. His wife, Henrietta, was a lot more reluctant to convert. She delayed her own conversion, and she delayed the baptism of her children, because remember in Catholic Church, you baptize your children. Lutheran, you get different views, but she delayed all that as well. She was sort of resistant to this. Karl Marx was also Lutheran. He became Lutheran, and he did keep the faith. Now listen to this. Even if he wasn't always devout or clear or particularly orthodox until probably his late teens and initial college years. So let me just make this really clear. If you're a teenager in here, you could be the next Karl Marx. But basically the point, he grew up in church, he reluctantly went to go to these things, and he turned out to put out the most satanic philosophy in the world. The point I'm trying to make is that we sometimes say, hey, youth groups ruin the youth, and it's true, the youth group doesn't always transition that, but like nominal assent, nominal like talking about God and like sort of nominally is not enough. It doesn't replace real discipleship. And so Marx is going to take these Christians, and what we see, I think this is true in some of the evangelical churches that we see today, that they end up inoculating people from the true gospel. I think that's really what happened to Marx. He was inoculated from the true gospel and spent his life hating Christians to the moment he wanted to literally kill God, he says. And so he started off, though, sitting in church until his, basically college years. Sound familiar? He definitely shed his faith during his college years and was unquestionably an atheist by the time he did his dissertation at the age of 23 in 1841. And so in his dissertation, he approvingly quoted first century Roman philosopher Lucretius's eulogy for Epicurus, who condemning the burden of oppressive religion. And he called it gruesome, grotesque, frightfully threatening against mankind. He says, religion lies at our feet completely defeated. This was his sort of, it's funny, Marx is, again, he sounds like a pathetic person in some ways. I'm just being honest, grandiose in his ability to cast down Christianity. But that's the triumph to which Karl Marx thereafter committed himself, religion at our feet. And I want you to make this clear. And here's why this is important. When you think of atheism and you think of Marxism and you think, it might be economic, or even when social Marxism, there's an idea that these things that are meant to be secular, right? They're meant to be secular. And I would argue that when you look at someone like Nietzsche, and we said this before, Nietzsche, if you study Nietzsche and you're like, who's Nietzsche? If you don't know who Nietzsche is, don't worry about it. But Nietzsche is the guy who says, the God is dead guy, the nihilism. Nietzsche is actually secular, essentially. His whole point is there's no purpose and meaning in life. Marx is not secular. He was never secular. When it says he's atheistic, he's more anti-theistic than anything else. Marx hated God, and his philosophy was meant to tear God down. It was always religious at its outset, and Marx always associated himself overtly with Satan. He overtly wrote about it. We talked about that last week. And so understand that there's religious language. And here's the key, I'm not saying that when the politician says the word equity, they're using religious language, but it certainly seems like they are as you start to listen to what we mean when we say equity. There's one of the most famous quotes of Barack Obama back during his presidency. They talked about if you do this on the tax code so that super rich pay all this money, but you have less tax revenue, do you still want to do it? And Obama tellingly said yes because of the sake of fairness. If you stop and we're all so dumb. We're like, what? I don't know, let me go to something else. But like, stop and think about what he's actually advocating here. He's basically saying it's worth it to tax rich people more money, even if it brings in less income because the loopholes and stuff make it so they pay less tax. It's worth it, even if less money comes in the government. It's worth making people poorer so it's fair. Think about the philosophy that's saying that the philosophy is not to help the poor people do better, it's to punish the people that are doing well so they're more like the poor people. That's the philosophy. Now, what philosophy brings that about? And Marx, you're gonna see, this is where he was. It was never enough to take a bit from billionaires, at the time millionaires, whatever. It was always their absolute destruction. It's still the same way. And so it's a funny thing. So listen to Marx here. Though this book's not a place to adequately treat the subject, Marx loved Martin Luther's rebellion against the church. He saw the Reformation. He's like, the Reformation's great. I'm going to do my own Reformation against God. And that's kind of his thing. It's a fascinating study. I don't want to get into it too much. But he was very anti-Catholic. And it would show up in his writings. He wrote of one political associate, David Urquhart, who he said this, with his Catholicism, et cetera, he grows more and more disgusting. He hated Catholicism. But again, viewing everything through class and economics, Marx criticized the monetary system as essentially a Catholic institution. So when you say the monetary system in the 1800s, he's not dealing with capitalism per se, but just the idea that there's a monetary system in place, the credit system as essentially Protestant. His whole point was he was in the same way that people want to go against heteronormativity today, right? Well, who established heteronormativity? The Bible. And so the idea of going against sort of a free market, well, who established the free market? The Bible. I mean, that is essentially what we're getting to. The Bible's established the free market. The Bible's established the idea that you get to keep what you earn, you have rights to do these. I mean, those basic ideas. Marx was against it from the outset. He saw them as being from the church. He lamented that the credit system does, quote, not emancipate itself from the basis of the monetary system any more than Protestantism has emancipated itself from the foundations of Catholicism. So he still thought the Protestants are too linked to Catholics. I'm like, so basically, the premise of this whole thing is that whatever came about, Marx became truly a monster in his thinking. But I want you to see the man for a moment. By the winter of 1837, the demons that young Karl wrestled with were increasingly tormenting him. He wrote his father a long, heartfelt, sorrowful letter that began, quote, "When I left you, a new world had opened up out before me, the world of love, which began by being a love deprived of all hope and full of frenzied yearnings." Like, what? In that state of mind, confessed the yearning poet turned philosopher to his father, it was, quote, inevitable that lyric poetry should be my chief interest. So, like you'd imagine, like, what are you going to go to school for? I'm gonna do music, and if you're a musician, great. But he's like, I'm just gonna make great music. But sadly, he conceded about poetry. He said, poetry could and must be only a casual companion. I wanted to come here and play beautiful music, but I can't. When he goes to Berlin, when he had broken all previous existing ties to Trier, where he began to study jurisprudence and above all, felt an urgent need to wrestle with philosophy. So essentially he came and said, I wanted to be a musician, but I felt I had to go into philosophy. The unrest reflected his poetry along with its associated demons would be transferred to his philosophy. So last week we studied Marx's poetry. Here I was from the pulpit reading some of those satanic things you could hear, but I think it did serve a good purpose. This was the man who was writing his Communist Manifesto at the time. Karl finished his letter, dated November 10th, 1837, about 4 a.m. to his dad. And as the candle went out and he could no longer see what he had written, nearing his final thoughts, he wrote, quote, so at the end of his letter, he writes, "A deep unrest has mastered me, and I shall not be able to lay the specters that haunt me until I'm in your dear presence." And you're like, like kind of funny. The man who would write about the specter of communism that haunted Europe was writing about the specters haunting him. A deep unrest had mastered him. So when you study what he says in his Communist Manifesto and what he says about himself, it was all autobiographical. One biographer referred to this as a monumental letter from the son to the father, which is fair to say. It took the father some time to digest it. On November 9th, Heinrich Marx vomited out a response in an epic letter oozing with bile. He vented at the boy, and what Heinrich wrote is worth quoting here at length. I want you to hear, this is a dad's letter to his son that eventually is like Marx has affected your life. Here's what his dad said to his son. He said, after his son said, a thing has mastered me, his dad's first response, "Good grief." Disorderliness, musty excursions into all departments of knowledge, musty brooding under a gloomy oil lamp, running wild in a scholar's dressing gown and with unkept hair instead of running wild over a glass of beer, unsociable withdrawal, and with neglect of all decorum and even of all consideration for the Father. In other words, Marx was like an introverted weirdo who couldn't enjoy a nice pint at the pub with the German folks around him. He just wasn't able to enjoy it. And his dad's like, what's up with you? He goes, I'm almost overwhelmed by the feeling that I'm hurting you, and already my weakness once again begins to come over me. But in order to help myself, quite literally, I take the real pills prescribed for me and swallow it all down, for I will be hard for once, and I'm going to give vent to all my complaints. He says, I'm going to be hard on you. I will not become soft-hearted, for I feel that I've been too indulgent. I've given too little utterance to my grievances, and thus, to a certain extent, have become your accomplice. I must and will say that you have caused your parents much vexation and little or no joy. Now, he's going to go on, but I want you to stop and understand the circumstances here. So Heinrich Marx was basically thinking, as he heard his son talk so melodramatically about demons and whatnot, that he's like, what's your problem? He's like, I coddled you too much. What are you doing? His dad's like, I feel like this is my fault. That's what he's saying. And so he goes on. He writes, on several occasions we were without a letter from you for months. And the last time was when you knew Edward was ill, mother suffering, and I myself not well. And moreover, cholera was raging in Berlin. And if that doesn't even call for an apology, your next letter contained not a single word about it, but merely some badly written lines and an extract from the diary entitled The Visit, which I'd quite frankly prefer to throw out rather than accept, a crazy botch work which merely testifies how you squander your talents and spend your nights giving birth to monsters, that you follow in the footsteps of the new immoralists who twist their words until they themselves do not hear them, who christen a flood of words a product of genius because it's devoid of ideas or contains only distorted ideas. So even back then, he's like, the things you say are dumb, and they're trying to act like they sound smart. I just love how he goes, as if we were men of wealth, my dear son disposed in 1 year of almost 700 tailors, contrary to all agreement, contrary to all usage, whereas the richest spend less than 500. He's like, look, on top of all this, we're not even rich, and you spend more than rich people spend of my money. He goes on in his letter, he goes, true, and he says, and these people that you spend it on, they take all your money. He goes, true, these poor young fellows sleep quite well, except when they sometimes devote half a night or a whole night to pleasure, whereas my hardworking, talented Karl spends wretched nights awake, weakens his mind and body by quote-unquote serious study, and denies himself all pleasure in order, in fact, to pursue lofty, abstract studies. But what he builds today, he destroys tomorrow, and in the end, he's destroyed his own work and not assimilated the work of others. In the end, the body is alien and the mind confused, whereas the ordinary little people continue to creep forward undisturbed and sometimes reach the goal better and at least more comfortably than those who despise the joys of youth and shatter their health to capture the shadow of erudition, which they would probably have achieved better in an hour's social intercourse with competent people and with social enjoyment into the bargain. In other words, he's like, stop being a loser, like hiding away in your basement as if you're a master of words. Everything you say is dumb. You should just go out with your friends for a pint. You'd probably do better in life. I conclude, for I feel from my more strongly beating pulse that I am near to lapsing into a soft-hearted tone, and I'm today intend to be merciless. He goes, I must add to the complaints of your brothers and sisters. From your letters, one can hardly see that you have any brothers or sisters. As for the good Sophie, who suffered so much for you, and Jenny, as so lavish in her devotion to you, don't even think of her when you don't need something from her. I've paid your money order for 160 tailors. I cannot and can hardly charge it to the old academic year, for that truly has its full due. And for the future, I don't want to expect many of the same kind of bills. To come here at the present moment would be nonsense. True, I know you care little for lectures, though you probably pay for them, but I will at least observe the decencies. When you come, basically, I'll give you a hug. That was Marx. The father ends up dying a few months later after this letter at the age of 56, and Marx did not attend his father's funeral. The journey from Berlin was just, quote unquote, too long, and he had other things to do. So Marx was a selfish brat, lazy to boot, and he gave his parents no joy in the way he did. With the death of his father, Marx turned to his mother for money. Heinrich's death was especially tragic because he was the only influence that had any idea of discipline that he tried to put into Karl's life, and the mother now faced an uphill battle all to herself. She writes, let me know when you receive the money, honey. She wrote to her son the year after her dad dies. He kept writing her about cash demands and with graduation looming, and she gave a heartfelt plea and wrote, may the good God give you happiness in all your undertakings and lead you along the right path. You have to wonder if Karl laughed at this poignant wish from his mom or shook his fist at his letter. He wasn't thinking about a good God, and there'd already been one too many thoughts put into writing and verse, as we already read, about rebellion against God, but Quite apart from Marx's writings, the devil also seemed to have a role in the daily details of his life in more mundane and likewise troubling ways. Among them, Marx the family man left much to be desired. This is a shocking section. What follows is a mere glimpse of Marx the man, that is, as a son, a father, a husband, and a partner. Karl's strained, abusive relationship with family and money got worse when he began his own family. Marx had viewed his parents parasitically, like a leech drawing blood from its host. He did this not only as a teen and a young adult, but as he himself became a parent and had children and teenagers. The man refused to work for wages, instead sucking as much income from his parents as possible. Now, what I want you to capture right now is when you think of like the welfare state, there was like a time in our history where we didn't have homeless people on every corner. There was a time in my own high school life where I could walk downtown. I remember when I came back, I was in Santa Barbara, I was on the rowing team, and we all had a regatta in San Diego. So everyone came and they stayed at my house, my rowing team, and that night we all went to, they wanted to like, let's go get into trouble in downtown San Diego. So we went down there, and it's such a sleepy city with totally clean. It's like, this city is so clean and so nice. Literally, I was in the city, downtown San Diego, like at 11 o'clock at night, and it was there, all we could comment on was how clean and nice it was. And almost sleepy. You go down there now, and there's 100% someone yelling obscenities at you, another person naked. Literally, I went to go meet Jimmy for a lunch down there, and again, this last year, and there again was a person laying on the street in the middle of the daytime, upside down naked with their crotch hanging out, and just moaning in the air. I walked up and I saw, is that a person? That's a butt. Why is that in the air? And it's just sitting right there. A big piece of dookie over here, like, what leads to these philosophies is worldviews about things, and Marx's worldview starts the whole thing. He never worked. Listen, you might know people like this, like, oh, they can't help it. Marx, literally, like, everything about this man is what the system produces. That's what's so fascinating to me. Like, this guy just leech. The host in such a parasitic relationship eventually has no recourse but to cut off both the parasite, to the parasite's writhing displeasure. Marx's parents would need to financially cut him off, enraging Marx in the process. He was draining his parents' lifetime savings. His suffering mother expressed the wish that Karl would get just a little bit of capital instead of just writing about it. Could he make a little bit of money? His suffering wife would say the same. Quote, Karl, if you'd only spent more time making capital instead of writing about it, we would have been better off. Karl was too busy devising his self-important theories in his personal office or public library to bother earning an income to provide for his family. He just didn't do it. He just decided not to work. He just waited for people to supply him money. He demanded that others provide his income. His parents were the go-to source, and long before there was Minnie the Moocher, there was Marx the Moocher. It would have been nice if Karl had merely gotten a job. He never did it. You know, I mean, look, politics aside, I mean, it's interesting watching people like Bernie Sanders, who never had an actual job in his life, own 3 homes. How does that happen? Telling us that everyone has too much money. Naturally, those who suffered most from Marx's refusal to secure work was his family, which was destitute from his laziness. His wife and kids lacked money, food, and a steady roof over their heads. They lacked even medical attention, and in the process, he constantly demanded more and more from his parents until they could no longer give more and insisted on some tough love for their selfish son. Think about how bad of a mooch you have to be like this. There's something wrong with this man. Well, that was enough for Karl. And let me go back a step. When you go to the Bible says if the person won't work, they shouldn't eat. Like, there's like an idea that the Bible commends us to hard work. Like, you're not being compassionate. When you help a lazy person not work, you enable their laziness. Like, people are supposed to work. Now, we're supposed to help people in trouble and need, but we're not supposed to enable it, right? Here's a Marx where they're twisting compassion on its head. He just wants to take. That was enough for Karl. What a dastardly sight that was. He told his parents to go to hell. Excuse my language. Some biographers claim or imply that he ultimately refused to attend his father's funeral, particularly for this reason, because they wouldn't give enough money. He definitely distanced himself from his mother. He ends up making his first visit to his mother later to pressure her for cash and guilted her all the end, right? Until she eventually said, hey, I can't keep using these IOUs you give me. He would say, give me money, I'll just give you an IOU, and he'd write on a piece of paper, I owe you, Mom, can I have the money now? And finally, like, these IOUs, I can't spend them for food. And so he just says, curse the old hag. And he left. At least for the momentary reconciliation, provided something of value, he gave the only pleasant time with his mother was when he was able to tell her off, he said. The committed communist was not finished finding a way to hit up the old lady for more subsidies. When she died, he had to use a lawyer to take all the money he could from her to go further from that. He ended up going to other family members, tried to get money from his uncles. I could go on, but the laziness and all this is obvious, but the hypocrisy is especially outrageous. Consider that point 3 of Marx and Engels' 10-point plan in the Communist Manifesto. When you look at Marxism, point number 3 is this. It called for the abolition of all right of inheritance. Now here's Marx, who wrote this literally as he's going to lawyers to take the inheritance money from his mother. So here, literally, the guy's literally taking inheritance money from his mother while he's writing that no person should ever have rights to have inheritance money, only the state should have it. This is the idea of what he was saying. Like so many communist kingpins who would follow Marx and Engels, they were exempting themselves from the stringent rules they were writing for the remainder of humanity. This is true for every cult, right? The cult leader's like, puts a very strong sort of sexual morality on you, but for the cult leader, he's like, God told me I'm supposed to have 20 wives. I mean, it's always like the special position here. So here's Marx saying, well, I need this money, but no one else should have it, right? Other people in the world did not deserve inheritance, but Karl Marx and Engels did. Speaking of Engels, his friend, right? Him and Marx went at it a bunch. Engels got really mad because Marx mooched so much and it became obscene to the point where Engels had to basically cut him off, his own friend. One biographer said Marx was continually begging money from Engels. Day after day, week after week, Marx could not hide his envy of Engels' wealth. He was always urgent and uncompromising. He seemed to be holding a pistol to Engels' head and saying that the money must come or else. Of course, Marx envied everyone's wealth. Marxism and communism thrive on the envy of others' wealth. This is kind of the idea that we said all along. And again, I'm not here to talk about politics. I'm here to talk about Christianity. If in the name of Christ we start talking about equity, that'd be like saying in the name of Christ we're using envy to be mad at what other people have. Does that make sense? Like it's a misuse. So it's not only the envy is the one part of the sin, but it's the blasphemy of using Jesus in the name of envy. Do you see what I'm saying? So when the church starts to adopt Marxist ideas about equity, we're now taking Jesus and using him to basically what? To basically validate our envy. And so this is a bad system. And so here's where you see this right now. I mentioned this before. When we want to vote, again, hey, we want to pay off your college loans. Well, I want my college loans paid off. I'm like, fine, but who's going to pay it off? It's not compassionate to vote for the bully to take money from your friend to pay off your bills. How's that compassionate? Well, I want to help the college students. I'm like, how are you helping them? Go give them money then. You want to help college students? Go give them money. Well, no, I want to help them by stealing that person's money. Well, it's not stealing. Well, if you're making them give it to them against their will, it certainly seems like stealing, doesn't it? No, we're voting for him. Like, okay, well, you're responsible for that. Like, if that's your political view, that's fine. But as a Christian, you should think twice about how you formulate. There's a morality here. Jesus certainly wouldn't be okay with that. Like, that's kind of the idea. Eventually, Engels basically cuts off Marx. He gets super mad because Engels' family, like his kid dies or his wife or someone dies, something bad happens. And Marx is like, well, that's cool, but hey, I need more money. And he's like, well, you're done, man. Eventually, Engels comes back. But Marx's insensitivity in this Engels moment was so obvious that even his most ardent admirers, the pro-Marxist people, they can't even defend it. Biographer Mary Gabrielle pauses here in the Engels situation to acknowledge that this is one of the many instances in which Marx showed himself to be a, quote, deeply self-centered man. In November 1849, 1 year after publishing his crowning work, the Communist Manifesto, Marx's landlord evicted him and his family because Marx's revulsion at the idea of providing for himself and his family. He didn't pay rent. He didn't have an income. He was a squatter. Marx would have ached for an all-encompassing cradle-to-grave, womb-to-tomb collectivist welfare state that confiscates revenue from wealthy people and redistributes it to lazy socialist academics and theorists peddling inane ideas for their messy desk piled with papers. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get back to is like there's a motivation for Marx's viewpoints. Marx was not a guy who worked hard and said, hey, we got to help the people that don't work hard. Marx was a lazy mooch that wanted people that worked hard to subsidize his lifestyle of not doing anything. And that's what he did. And then behind the whole thing, he hated God and wanted to take God down. The landlord was fed up with Marx's resistance to grooming. Like literally, so not only did he not pay for anything, not only was a mooch, he didn't like groom himself. Karl drank too much, smoked too much, and he never exercised, and he suffered from warts and boils from the lack of washing, and he stunk. Now, you laugh, you say this is silly, why am I telling you this? It was like actually noteworthy. Like in every single biography of Marx was a reference to how much he stank and how his warts and boils were everywhere. In fact, he writes about his own boils. It's just fast. Look, as a villain in the story, like Satan's a villain, Marx needed Jesus Christ, but as a guy who just keeps going towards this thing, like the philosophies we lose, like wisdom, take Proverbs, like wisdom leads to life and happiness. Like these are philosophies of death, and in this case, it's an ugliness. I want to say this in the most careful way possible. I saw an article, I mentioned this before, there's an article I read that said that exercise is a right-wing activity. it just seems like the new left hates everything healthy and beautiful and good. And the new left is 100% through and through Marxist. I just want to understand it's Marxist to the core. And Marx hated all these things. He didn't like grooming. He didn't like that. And I'm not saying that everyone that's on the left doesn't groom. But I just love the fact that here's this guy, he has warts and boils. He stunk, quote, washing, grooming, and changing his linens are things he does rarely, and he likes to get drunk, stated the Prussian police spy report. They, quote, he has no fixed times for going to sleep or waking up. He slept when he wanted, he woke up when he wants. And for his apartment, everything is broken down, busted, spilled, smashed, falling apart, from toys and chairs and dishes and cups and tables and tobacco pipes and on and on. In a word, said the report, everything is topsy-turvy. To sit down becomes a thoroughly dangerous business. Quite literally, the chair you chose to sit upon in his household could collapse. This is Marx. So true is for the governments that adopt Marxism. This is systematic, not only of his house, but himself. Just as we mentioned, he mentioned the boils. I mean, I just can't resist this. I just have to tell you. But Paul Johnson wrote that they varied in numbers and size and intensity, but at one time or another, they appeared on all parts of his body, including his cheeks, the bridge of his nose, his bottom. He couldn't write on his privates, everywhere. They were brought on a nervous collapse marked by trembling and huge bursts of rage. He literally had moments where he could do nothing but stand up because he had so many boils and carbuncles and things exploding on his body. The boils got so bad at times, like I said, he could only stand upright or lie on his side. Doctors and stuff were like, we're not sure what's going on, but it's probably the not washing that did it. They might have been at his worst. This is interesting. When his boils were at, this is just coincidental, you can like put these timelines together. When his boils were at their worst is when he was writing Das Kapital, which might explain the sense of the author. The author did a good job here. He said, Marx's boils might have been at their worst when he was writing Das Kapital, which might explain the sense of oozing pain one feels when reading this blistering piece of work. But Marx said, whatever happens, quote, I hope the bourgeois, as long as they exist, will have cause to remember my carbuncles. And you bet they have. I mean, Marx's boils persist in the lives of the very bourgeois. They more than remember his intellectual boils, which fester to this day. I love that paragraph. I had to read it. Anyways, Marx, in short, was a slob. He was sloppy in his home life, in his desire to earn income, and his keeping of papers, and even in his research. Even sympathetic sources underscore his failures to provide for his family. Think of what the Bible says. The man who doesn't provide for his family is terrible, right? The Bible makes this clear. Like, this is a basic premise. And in the West, we would say hard work, and you figure out how to do that. We just work hard. We get away through it. Marx didn't do this at all. He didn't even try. Quote, he and Jenny, his wife, spent their majority of their life together in considerable and frequently miserable poverty, relying on the contributions from supportive friends, mainly Engels. And this was written from a left-wing writer in an article in Salon, which is not a right-wing source. So these are the people that are pro-Marx, and even they're acknowledging this. So this isn't a hit piece on him. This is just a known quantity about him. Not surprisingly, Karl and Jenny had no enthusiasm for any religious faith. They didn't pass it on to their children at all. His stories to his children were pretty hardcore. He told stories about this guy named Hans Rockel, who had a toy store and basically he said, who kept an enchanted toy shop and who, like Marx, was always in debt. And the shop had all sorts of intriguing toys and wood carvings, little men, queens, dwarves, birds, animals. And Rockel wasn't a mere toy maker, he was a magician, but his powers were limited because he could never meet his obligations to the devil. He made a pact with the devil, writes Paine, and there was no escaping from it. In other words, Marx's bedtime Christian story to his kids was, there's a toy maker. He made magic toys, but he had to always make the toys because the devil, he made a pact with the devil. And so someone might take them away. And the kids are like, they grow up he loved the devil. Eleanor recalls stories of being frightened as the stories of Gothic horror novelists of the day. But here's the crucial moral of the story. So in Paine, one of his main biographers writes, he says, there can be little doubt that those interminable stories were autobiographical. And it's true. When he wrote his poetry last week, we talked about, and his children's stories, they all have the same theme. It's people making deals with the devil. Hans Rockel, who bought and sold wooden men, was always in danger of losing them to the devil. The pact with the devil is a central theme of his poetry, Ulanem, remember? And appeared in various disguises in his early poems. It was a subject on which Marx had brooded frequently, not only in his youth, but in Goethe's Faust was his Bible, the one book which he regarded with unreserved admiration, and he liked to roar out verses of Mephistopheles, who, just like he liked to sign himself as Old Nick, and he had the devil's view of the world, the devil's malignity. And he understood this. He wasn't accidental. Among these works, Paine continued are certain images that constantly recur in his writing. So here's a guy covered in boils that doesn't want to do work, who's writing things about Satan and the devil. right? His writings constantly talk about death, torture, executioners, mutilation, even ruptured wombs, as well as the ferocious manner in which he blistered his enemies with gutter language and vicious words. Paine is justified in asserting that Marx spent much of his life in a, quote, helpless rage against the world. In a letter after letter, he roars his disgust at the world and at people with unbridled malevolence. And this is true not only for his enemies, but for his friends. Like, he's the kind of guy that would just turn on his friends like on a dime. And so he used to have these, when you look at like later communist countries, they would always have these purges. You guys ever heard of this? Like a country would have a purge. And what happened is someone's not towing the line, so they would purge their whole family and the people that they heard about it. Like a burn the ground down. The purges were not a bug, they were a feature. Right at the beginning of Marx's work, he constantly had purges of his friends. They'd have these communist parties and whatnot, and the purges were not invented in Soviet Russia, writes Paine. They appeared at the very beginning of Marx's communism, were part of the system of his very friendships on a regular basis. He would have these purges where he'd get everyone together and they'd completely blast someone and sort of annihilate them in their group. Prior to London, where Karl and Jenny would spend most of their married life, one of their earliest stops in starting their family had been in Brussels, where they moved in 1845, and they had their first child, Laura. They basically lived in a boarding house located in the heart of Brussels, and right over top of them was basically the great Cathedral of St. Michael. And so they spent 2 years in the shadow of St. Michael's, and it was in the shadow of this giant statue that Marx composed the Communist Manifesto. It was just a start for him in many ways. Here he began not only an ideological battle against money, but a personal one, which took a terrible toll on his marriage to Jenny. And everyone that basically helped Marx was miserable. He sent his wife constantly begging to relatives. In one case in August 1850, Jenny crossed the English Channel in a storm and arrived soaking wet at Karl Dutch's relative's home, unrecognizable. And according to one biographer, the uncle told the poor, disheveled, dripping wife that Marx's family had about as much enthusiasm subsidizing godless communism as did that of Engels. They hoped that his work, Das Kapital, would make money. It made no money. Nor did Manifesto. It didn't make any money. By the time it did, they were dead. But in that bitterly cold season, the family baby, an infant baby named Heinrich Guido, named for Marx's father, ended up succumbing to the elements not long after his first birthday. That means he was too cold and starving. Really, he arguably perished as a victim of his communist father's irresponsibility, who didn't heat the home, didn't provide food. Jenny connected the dots and basically said as much. Jenny left a despairing account of these days from which her spirits and her affection for Marx never really recovered. She accused him of these very things. Marx, meanwhile, kept up pressure on his mother the whole time. Mom, where's the money? March 1851, he told her that she did not intervene to cover one of his interminable IOUs, that he was going to be in trouble, so Henrietta made him get arrested. He's like, I'm going to let you get arrested. The low point for Jenny and Karl during these trials and woes was the death of their 8-year-old son, Edgar, in 1855. Mary Gabrielle, author of a sympathetic biography, so this is the person who's pro-Marx, described vividly and painfully how Edgar died of intestinal tuberculosis exacerbated by unhealthy living conditions. Again, this is a person pro-Marx. The loss was heartbreaking. Marx actually loved the kid immensely. The death was called the greatest tragedy in Marx's life. But Mary Gabrielle says Mr. and Mrs. Marx's soul-searching for answers about Edgar's death could have led them to only one conclusion, and that is that the revolutionary path that they had chosen had killed them. So their argument was their child died because he was a martyr in their cause for a revolution against sort of the state, the capital. When Marx began writing Das Kapital, disease resulting from deprivation had killed 2 of his children. And that deprivation was beyond dispute the fault of Marx. So here's a guy so lazy his kids are actually dying, and all he can do is play victim. The death of his children would only continue. Other children ended up committing suicide and different things, but not the most pleasant guy we should want to emulate. Again, what he really longed for was what his socialist progressivist descendants in the West would seek to bequeath, which was a giant collectivist nanny state where big brother, big sister would assume the task of taking care of Karl's families for him. His task was never to have to work and just to make it do. I just want to understand what's going on. The individual who came closest to providing that service for him was a nanny named Lenchen, and she basically joined communism. She got sucked into it, and so she served Marx. She slaved away for him, and so to that he never paid her a cent. This is kind of interesting. The only thing he did was cheat on his wife with her. So boils and all, the one thing Marx could get himself sort of ready to do was to go cheat on his wife with this woman who had devoted herself to kind of cleaning their house and helping him out. And here's the weird thing that's interesting. She never got paid a cent. One Marx biography says that Lenchen was Marx's chattel to be exploited unmercifully. And so here's what's ironic. The champion, quote unquote, of the proletariat, the guy who supposedly loves the poor people, the fulminator against low-paid workers, the protester against wage exploitation, he never paid her a penny. While he was writing about poor people not getting their due, he was literally exploiting a poor woman. Many commentators or whatnot believe Marx actually had raped the woman, but we don't know. But given the fact that he never interacted with or had worked with the proletariat, Lenchen was literally the only poor person Marx ever actually knew, and he exploited her worse than you could exploit pretty much anyone. Lenchen ends up giving birth to a baby boy, so he has a boy out of wedlock, and Marx, good guy that he is, doesn't ever concede the unfortunate child was his. And so his buddy, Engels, had to pretend it was his child just to help get him into a foster home. And then on Engels' death, he admitted it was actually Marx's kid. Marx never even deigned to look at the kid. So this guy's, happy guy. When you think about the family values and you encounter one other another sordid element of his life, and I'm not going to get into this chapter, I'm just going to make a statement about it, but as you go through this whole section, the things he wrote about blacks and Jews are pretty much as ugly as you can get. I mean, if you read through, I'm not going to say any of it, but he just was 100% as racist as a person can be, very unpleasant. He didn't hide it, even though he was an ethnic Jew. The things he said about Jews was pretty gnarly. Jonathan Sperber notes that Marx's correspondence is filled with contemptuous remarks about Jews, and even his admiring biographer, Francis Wien, who constantly defends Marx, admits that he sprayed anti-Semitic insults at his enemies with savage glee. He loved saying crazy things. Walter Williams, an economist and a well-known black conservative, states unequivocally that Marx was an out-and-out racist and anti-Semite. It's interesting to me how often that sort of figures on the political left were racist. I mean, Margaret Sanger, a hero of the left who started Planned Parenthood, was an out-and-out racist who started Planned Parenthoods in inner cities to basically stop black people from breeding. And people put, if you go to I remember when McDonald's used to have pictures of heroes. They had like Gandhi, and Margaret Sanger would be on the wall next to Gandhi. It's pretty gross. In a seminal edited volume on Karl Marx and religion, Saul Padover sums up Marx's anti-Semitic views. I'm not going to say, he's just bad, all right? Let me just keep going. It was not good. Finally, home was not a happy place for the Marx family, all right, in 1862. So think about how old Marx is in 1862. I mean, he's getting quite a bit older here. Marx wrote a letter to Engels noting that every day his wife expressed a wish to die. In another letter, he, during one of his financial crises, he says, "Blessed is he who has no family." As for marriage, he said, "There's no greater stupidity for people of general aspirations to marry and surrender themselves to the small miseries of domestic and private life." Sounds like a pleasant man. And he said, "If I had to live my life over again, I wouldn't marry." In so many ways, Karl Marx's personal life reinforced his desire for the kind of revolutionary state he not only wanted, but he needed. This is also true for Engels and many of the long line of communist revolutionaries, from Lenin to Mao to Castro to Che Guevara, and on and on. Now, when you say to yourself, Matt, who would like these things? Like when we used to do, so tonight's a Tuesday night, right? We used to do this, it used to be, we called it Skeptics Corner. And so it was an open forum. And so we tried to host it places. We go to coffee shops, and we grew out of the coffee shop. So we're like, well, let's go to, I think it was UCSD. They had a cafe there. We're like, we could just go to the cafe and do our study there. So we went to the Che Guevara Cafe. Che Guevara's a straight up Marxist, right? And so inclusive and the rest, I think like just absolutely, face on the wall, people wear a shirt on his, like he was lionized, and he was basically a devout Marxist. And then again, here's a quote, this is a quote from in Aristotle. He says, "Men start revolutionary changes for reasons connected with their private lives." And it's true. I mean, this is true both good and bad. I mentioned before, when you read about Washington's biography, it's just fascinating to me that George Washington was in so much personal debt to like England and France when we started the Revolutionary War. I'm not saying that's why he did it, but it does help that he had no more debt anymore. I mean, just not to say that's why we did it, but like maybe America just was like, instead of no taxation without representation, it was, no, I don't want to pay my debts. England Express wasn't working out for him. But in this case, in Marx's case, and all these others, the changes are often connected with their private lives. And this is the truth for Marx, right? He lived the life of an atheist communist revolutionary, and he died the death of one as well. Jenny died in London on December 2nd. She was buried in unconsecrated grounds at Highgate Cemetery, and Marx didn't even go to the funeral. Karl himself hung on a bit longer, and depressed, weak, miserable, and finally he died 2 years later and was buried next to her. His coffin bore no cross, but 2 red wreaths, faithful to the communist religion to the very end. Now, this is where I'm ending it. You're like, that is exciting, Matt, thanks very much. Contrast the philosophy of Marx, which is focused on misery, it aims at misery, It's motivated by jealousy and hatred. And you think about what the Bible says, even on Sunday, we're saying the fruit of the Spirit. And you look at Galatians. Just go to, if you have Galatians 5, go to Galatians 5 for a minute. I just read this Sunday, but I just want you to see this again. Because there's a couple things I want to get to right now. The first point I want to make is that Marx's viewpoint is encapsulating the flesh. Right? It's a view that doesn't try to rise above it. Right? It's not trying to say, hey, let's focus on our good values. It's like, no, let's just go all the way down. The desires of the flesh, Galatians 5:16, Paul says, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit. And the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. And so, Paul mentions these are satanic. And he says these desires are opposed to each other, and they're meant to keep you doing the things you want to do. But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now, the works of the flesh are evident. When he says they're evident, notice what Paul's saying. He says the works of the flesh are obvious to us. They're clearly dumb, bad, not of God. And what are they? Sexual immorality. We see that in Marx. Impurity, obviously in Marx. Sensuality, right? Sensuality doesn't mean like listening to Sade and having like wine and cheese. Sensuality is like focused on feelings. Like basically most charismatic churches are sensual. They're basically like, I need to feel something. So sensuality was like, I need to have this thing happen. Idolatry, sorcery, which is really like drugs. That means pharmakeia, we get it. Enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. Literally, Marx was like, this is what communism brings forth. This is who Marx was. And Paul says, I warn you as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. The contrast of these things, I want to understand the contrast to Marxism is not capitalism and conservatism. Because economic Marxism died. Now, when people are talking about it right now, it's pathetic. It's stupid. It's not the threat that it was in some ways. It's dumb. But the philosophy behind Marxism, which is what? Find an oppressor and then set everyone else as a victim of that oppressor and unite all the people against that oppressor to give power to you who's uniting them. That's essentially Marxism. And economically, Marxists tried it all the way up until World War II happened. And after World War II, the proletariat didn't rise up and say, let's get rid of the nations and start our own thing. They just went back to capitalism. The Marxists basically like slunk into the darkness, and they basically reemerged in what we call social Marxism. And I mentioned BLM because they're social Marxists. And so again, who is the bourgeois? Who's the people you got to get rid of is essentially heteronormative thinking. It is white Christian men at the very top of the pile. And so when you look at the sort of the CRT ranking and hierarchy, the ultimate enemy is not economic, it is social. And the argument is everyone needs to unite against them because they are the villain. And when I say this is true, this isn't just from the wackadoodle person writing their blog. This is true from the President of the United States, Homeland Security, telling us the greatest threat is the things that we're talking about. Not only is this not true statistically, we hear about race crimes. Like there's so few race crimes in our nation, and you can look at this statistically and you can check it out. There's so few race crimes, hate crimes, if you want to define them as that. There's so few, even the ones that you can actually, that aren't hoaxes, there's so few that we actually have to make them up. The demand for them just doesn't reach past the supply. Now, stop and ask yourself, why would we live in a system that needs to make up race hoaxes? Because the people in power need you to hate someone so they can have more power. They need you to hate someone. And economically, it gets tired to talk about the billionaires, and yet they're still doing it, but socially, it's always the case. And so as a Christian, and you start to think of these things, the answer to the Marxist ideology isn't about voting, it's about that, yes, you should vote well, but it's about knowing the Lord Jesus Christ because his philosophy constantly goes against it. So let me just say this. Remember how in the last book I said, if you focus on the me-centered thing, you're doing transgender thinking, even though if you're not transgender, if you're not focused, again, on love, you're not aiming for love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. If you're not aiming at these things, you are by nature wallowing in Marxism. The philosophies of Marxism, the things that brought it out, the general hatred, the need, it's a mob looking for someone to find, that's terrified looking for something to find. And trust me right now, the entire political system is using religious language to do it, but the churches are doing it. The schools are doing this from a very young age. I mean, the basic idea is to learn to hate that other people have more than you. And that idea doesn't just come out economics. They're going to say, well, they hate because you're a patriarchy. It's a systemic system of oppression because your whiteness, you need to stretch out of your whiteness, as we mentioned, right? The hatred of that system. And so if you sit there and say, well, the answer is I'm going to be like white pride. Shut up. Like basically the whole idea is to stop that whole view and to focus on Jesus Christ. So if you think that in the church, our constant focus on ourselves, or the constant focus on getting more, if your church, if it's constantly about like, here's how to get more success in your life, here's how this, how are we that much different than the things we're reading? The only hope is Jesus Christ. It is the only hope. And you hear this, you're like, yeah, I get it, it's the only hope. I don't mean just for salvation, I mean for a good life. Remember, like the wages of sin is death. And you just look at this man who his whole life was in misery. He was mean to everybody. Everyone basically hated him. He abused the people around him. He was literally covered in sores and boils, and he stank, didn't care about anyone. He was a mooch and lazy, and he hated God and liked Satan and talked about it openly. And this is the prevailing viewpoint of most people in the world that are in the Western countries right now. And the only people opposing them, it seems, tend now to be Christians. And you have to ask yourself, what's up with that? I always thought at the end of the days, we would get to a place where the bad guys, if you will, and not that anyone's beyond redemption, but the people that are opposing the Christian viewpoint would be subtle. You know, like in the movie, they're subtle. They're hiding in plain sight. They're really smart. This isn't the case at all. Literally, the story of, I mentioned before, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, these are the Marxist organizations, right? People are like openly like, we love terrorists. We love murdering babies. We love doing these things. Like, you're like, what? We don't think that you should have to work out or bathe or take care of your family, or why should you have to work, or oh, the poor criminal that you misgendered when you were telling him to get out of your store, who can sue you. You know, you're like, how do we get here? Listen, you might say this is irrelevant to me, but let me say this, it's relevant to your kids. I mean, like the kids upstairs that are learning these things, like it's up to you to recognize this so that when they come home, they start talking about equity, when we start talking about these things, you can sit down and explain to them the gospel of Jesus Christ. The God that frees us from these things. And remember, we're not hoping for a fun future where everyone gets along through compromise. A king is coming, and he will rule with justice and equality. And so all this equity crap is literally just Marxism in disguise. And if you want, you can go back to some of these studies. You can go back to the last books we talked about. I don't have time to go into it, but this book will take you through Marx, and hopefully you've gotten some helpful hints on how to spot it. So let me say a prayer. God, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for this work. I pray, Father, in our own lives, they would reflect our beliefs. Lord, I pray that as Christians, we would shine. We would take care of our families. We would work hard. We would recognize how much this is reflected in what we believe about you. Help us not to act like victims. Father, we are the rebellious ones. You saved us. We were the perpetrators of the sin. We were not mere victims in a cage somewhere, but you saved us while we were still sinners. Help us to view the folks that are caught up in these Marxist ideals. Help us to point them to something better and to a real salvation that doesn't lead to death and warts. Father, I pray that we would understand the grossness of these Marxist ideas, of the equity agenda. It all is meant to sound good, and it's all just a revenge for people who hate and covet and envy. Father, I pray that we recognize our only hope truly is the focus not against these things and to hate those folks, but to put our focus on the Lord Jesus Christ, who's given us new desires of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control. None of these things are full of envy. None of these things are full of these things. Help us to be people of true light. Help us understand the true stakes, and help us to truly shine properly in this darkness. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next time.
Pastor Matt Smith, senior pastor of Barabbas Road Church. For the past 16 years, it has been my joy to equip the saints for the work of the ministry by preaching the Bible verse by verse, line by line, the whole counsel of God. Our audio and video messages have reached over 158 countries and are listened to by over 5,000 people each week. Many of you who listen weekly have been through our doors, and I'm thankful that you continue to use us as a resource for your enrichment and edification. We consider you all a part of our extended church family. As you know, San Diego is a spiritually dark and financially difficult place to exist as a local church, and yet, by God's plan and purpose, He's placed us here to boldly challenge the false faith by teaching that Jesus is the only way, truth, and life. My desire is that we would continue to be a bastion of light in this dark area, that we would keep bringing you consistent biblical teaching on a weekly basis. To that end, I'm asking that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us in your missions giving. To do so, go to Barabbas.com/give. I'm thankful for this task and look forward to our partnership for years to come.